Okay, so welcome to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I do apologize for those of you who are watching the playback. There was a snafu with the timing of the start of this meeting, and we ended up starting very late. So I do apologize if that impacted your Sunday at all, and I hope that you still enjoy watching the playback. I welcome your comments and questions through email. And yeah, please be sure to join us in 2 weeks for part 2. So jumping right into the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, it's a big deal. It's a big work, and there are lots and lots of concepts in here. And my intention is to create something to present to beginners. So a succinct kind of overview of what's in the Yoga Sutras. With that said, I do tend to be a very thorough person, so I'm doing my best to balance those two things. So before we start going in, there's a mantra that I like to use before working with teaching people things, especially working on learning about the theory and the philosophy of yoga and the scriptures. This mantra is called the Sahana mantra, and the translation is, we have come together as students and teachers to share this learning. Let us be protected and nourished. Let us have the energy and awareness to fulfill this task, and let us enjoy our time together. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti, peace on earth, in the sky, and in the heavens. Okay, so if you please put your feet flat on the floor for a moment, sit up as straight as you can comfortably with your hands in your lap. Eyes can be closed or open, that's your choice. Anytime there's any kind of mantra going on, you can think of it as a sound healing. And if you're the one doing the mantra, then you're projecting out the healing into the world for the benefit of others, but also benefiting it from yourself because it's originating in your body. So you're shifting your own vibration and the vibration of the space and the people around you. And if you're listening to mantra, the correct mental posture is to be receiving. You're receiving a blessing, you're receiving a gift, a healing. And in that case, you would just remain relaxed and open to receiving the benefits that resonate with your free will. Okay, so I will begin. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Be relaxed as you hear the mantra in the sacred language of Sanskrit. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. And then we just sit for a moment or two, letting the vibration sink deeper and deeper through the skin, through the flesh, to the deepest parts of your being, all the way into your bones, into your brain, all the way down to your soul. Thank you. So here we go. The concepts, ideas that I will be sharing today are based on the work of 2 women, Nishala Joy Devi and Rama Jyoti Vernon. Both of these women were teachers to my teachers, so I consider them my grand teachers. I've never met either one of them. In fact, Rama has left her body about 2 years ago, but she left behind this really beautiful, really comprehensive and thorough work on the Yoga Sutras. She studied under Iyengar and many other really important figures in the yoga world for many years and studied Sanskrit, was a dedicated Sanskrit scholar. And so her translation and ideas about the Yoga Sutras will include information, quotations from many swamis, many holy men who are considered to be highly accomplished in the art of yoga and the science of yoga. She also brings her own ideas in, which is a refreshing thing because she is a woman like us, like me. So it's refreshing to me. And compared to Nishala's translation, I would say it's a lot more traditional, a lot more masculine, and that's fine. I love Nishala's translations and discourses on the Yoga Sutras because they are a very feminine take on everything. And her translations are so different, even down to the way she takes the Sanskrit syllables out and interprets their meaning. It's very heart-centered. Nishala's work is all about the heart and living from your heart and developing your intuition. So I think these two works balance each other nicely. And I think it's really important to study discourses and translations from different people, because every time you have exposure to a different way of looking at something, you're deepening your understanding of it. You have new material to chew on mentally and to digest and incorporate into your overview, your understanding of the world and yourself and the teachings. So yeah, Nishala also studied under some really important figures in yoga, both Indian and American, and she's highly regarded in the yoga therapy community. And her trainings are really sought after. She actually was she was one of the spearheading people for the Dean Ornish program for heart disease. She is one of the people who brought yoga into the awareness of our medical community as a useful tool to treat chronic disease. And her specialties are working with people who have heart disease and cancer. Okay, so the Yoga Sutras are referred to in lots of different ways. Nishala says they are the foundation for transformation. Oh, so beautiful. And we're going to find out why. And Rama says they are the heartbeat of yoga. She really has a way of putting things in such a poetic frame. So both of these we can take in and keep in mind as we go into our studies. The word sutra itself comes from two Sanskrit syllables. Su means to thread or sew together, and tra means in order to transcend. So we're sewing or threading something together in order to transcend. So what are we sewing together? I think the teachings. And in order to transcend what? Well, to transcend our own limitations as human beings, our perceived limitations, to transcend whatever it is that's causing us suffering. There are 195 brief, succinct aphorisms, and that's what a sutra is. So every little verse here, you could theoretically compare them to like Bible verses. Each one is considered a sutra, and that's why we have Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, because there are many. There are 195 of them. And throughout the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali is teaching us what yoga is, the reason for human suffering, why we do yoga, how to approach yoga, and practices to achieve yoga. So the Yoga Sutras are attributed to Patanjali, who is also referred to as the father of yoga. He was an Ayurvedic doctor and a Sanskrit grammarian. And the sutras are dated to around 250 current era AD. So they were compiled from existing teachings which were passed on orally from guru to student for thousands of years, as was the tradition in India. And Patanjali condensed this vast body of teachings that were passed down for thousands of years into one fairly concise written outline that tells us all of these things, what yoga is, the reason for suffering, why we do yoga, etc. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are relatively new compared to the other ancient Indian teachings, as you might have already noticed. So they address the more gross aspects of human liberation and being than the previous teachings did. The previous teachings are a lot more subtle. They're a lot more esoteric. For this reason, many believe that Patanjali compiled these sutras out of compassion for the needs of people of the current age, which is the age of chaos, the Kali Yuga. And we do tend to observe this kind of shift in the teachings from India as time goes on. They become less subtle, less esoteric, and more gross. Gross just meaning larger, more obvious content. So another example that comes to mind is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is a scripture that came sometime after the Yoga Sutras and is definitely a lot more concerned with the physical body, how to do asana, how to care for your body, nutrition, the proper ways of breathing, etc. We do get that in the Yoga Sutras, but not as much and not as explicitly involved with the outer layers of life. The Yoga Sutras are more involved with the inner layers. So that's the progression we see as we get further and further into the Kali Yuga, the era of chaos and destruction. The teachings need to be adapted to the minds of the people who are living at that time. I think that's really beautiful. So in the Yoga Sutras, there are 4 chapters. The Samadhipada describes the qualities of samadhi, which is the state of oneness between individual and the object that they're meditating on. Samadhi can be compared to nirvana or inner peace or whatever you want to think of it as. It's a really central idea to the Yoga Sutras, the samadhi. So we're going to get a lot of description of what it is, the different phases of samadhi. And then we have so yeah, here's a question. It outlines the subtle aspects of yoga and therefore is usually taught to students who've already reached a certain level of skill with their yoga practice. So typically in a yoga school, they will go straight to sadhana pada, which is chapter 2, which describes the practices themselves. And it's considered to be more gross and less subtle. Why? Why would teachers decide to start with chapter 2 instead of chapter 1?
Probably because chapter 2 is probably easier for the human mind to wrap their mind around, while samadhi is probably going to make people question their beliefs and their realities a little bit more.
Yeah, it can be a lot to take in the more esoteric stuff if you haven't had any previous exposure. It's intense, especially in a culture like ours that's predominantly Christian, predominantly individualistic, instead of community minded. Um, so yeah, I kind of agree with that strategy. However, there's a lot of like religious trauma in our society. And I think that telling people, do this, you don't need to understand why, just do it. I'll tell you why later. Um, it just rubs me the wrong way. So that's why I'm doing the opposite of what a lot of teachers do. I'm going to go straight into chapter 1. It gives a lot of background information. It gives a lot of the why, and it maps out like this is where you're headed. And then chapter 2, we go back and say, this is how we're going to get there. Okay. So yeah, chapter 2, Sadhanapada, is where we find the 8 limbs of yoga. Well, 5 of the 8 limbs. Vibhuti-pada has the final 3 limbs. Patanjali describes the siddhis, the special superpowers that are possible through the practice of yoga. And then the Kaivalya Pada, the last chapter, is a summary of the previous 3 chapters and goes into further detail about the workings of karma and the gunas, as well as further describing the siddhis, the superpowers. This chapter is mostly not taught in the West. Most teachers in the West avoid teaching about the siddhis at all. There's this huge ego going on with people in our culture, and I think that they avoid teaching about the siddhis because there are definitely going to be those out there who want to just get to that. And that's not the right approach, first of all. And second, if you are trying explicitly to get to a certain thing and you're striving for it, you won't get there. Every like piece of yoga that represents some sort of advancement happens all on its own through your practice. We can never try to say, well, I'm working on getting to samadhi. Well, you probably won't get there. Samadhi unfolds naturally as a result of your effort without you trying for it, if that makes sense. So, okay, here we go. The first Yoga Sutra. Atha Yoga Anushasanam. And now we will follow along with the scriptures of yoga and revere them. That's what Rama's translation says, and it's pretty in line with all the other translations. And then Nishala says, with humility, an open heart and mind, we embrace the sacred study of yoga. Saying pretty much the same thing, but in a much more sweeter way. Okay. So, but Patanjali doesn't say, and now we're going to learn the Yoga Sutras, or now we will hear them. He says we will follow along and revere them. And I think that he's trying to convey that the teachings have a life of their own, a current that will pull you in and along. And just to come into contact with these teachings is to be changed. Just to be in contact with these teachings is to be changed. And my colleague, Suli, who was in the yoga therapy training with me, compared it to Morpheus offering Neo the red pill or the blue pill. Are you ready? You gonna do this? Let's go. So the second Yoga Sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. This sutra is the beginning and the end of yoga. The beginning and the end of the Yoga Sutras. It's the guru bead on the mala. So if you've ever seen a mala, there are 108 beads and they're all joined together by one bead at the end. The loop closes and there's one bead slid over the two ends of the string. That's the guru bead. It's the bead that holds it all together. It's the bead where you start and where you end on when you're doing your mantra prayers. So it's a really big deal. Everything that we study in the Yoga Sutras points back to this one sutra. It's where we begin, and at the end, it's where you end up. So Rama says yoga is to still or quiet the waves of the mind, which are stormy indeed. That's a pretty good translation. It's pretty accurate, literally. Anishalas is yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. Now remember, Anishala is all about the heart, the uniting of consciousness in the heart. And that just brings this beautiful image of all of your awareness, all of your energy, all of your focus shrinking down into this heart space. And what's possible when we're working from that space. So in this verse, the word, let's see, the word yoga is derived from Sanskrit yuj, or it means to yoke, harness, bind, or fuse, or bring together two things, right? It's often thought of as an oxen joined to its plow. According to Rama, it can also be defined as reunion, communion, integration, and reintegration of the self with the universe. Man with creation, material with the spiritual, the finite with the infinite, the individual with the universal consciousness. So reuniting, coming back together, back to where you started. And at the same time, it can be thought of as the opposite of binding, since yoga is a way for us to release our impediments to freedom. So in one aspect, we're binding to something, but in another aspect, we're letting go. We're releasing our impediments. Some translations, many translations, use the word suppress. They say yoga is to suppress the waves of the mind. That's a really forceful way of putting it, and I have no idea how that sounds in Hindi, but in English it sounds pretty harsh. So I really stay away from that word. It's forceful, related to repression, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're using yoga to bring forth the things that we haven't seen. And Iyengar says we're using yoga to bring light onto the things that were dark, to bring into awareness that which we were unaware of, and to bring into consciousness or under conscious control the things that were previously unconscious or involuntary. And a good example of that is the breath. For most people, the breath happens automatically. They don't think about it. It's subconscious, right? But when we want to, we can actually control it consciously too. And when we do, what happens? Well, we're going to find out. So this word chitta has two meanings. The first being that it's individuated consciousness. So there's this idea of there being an ocean of chit out there in the universe. It's the universal consciousness that's everywhere and it is everything. And chitta is a piece of chit, but individuated. That's the ta at the end. So we have taken a vessel, like a body, for example. We have scooped into the ocean of chit, and now we have a being with a little bit of chit in it, the chitta. And it appears to be separate, but yet it's not. Just like the waves of the ocean, individual beings will come up, they will appear to be separate for a little while, but they still maintain connection with the entire ocean. They still maintain the composition of the entire ocean. And then eventually they go back into the ocean. It's a beautiful metaphor. Chitta is also used to describe a particular part of the mind. So when it's used this way, it's talking about the subconscious mind, the place where all the impressions are stored. So impressions are just memories, I guess you could say, that are written on your subconscious mind, and it's the memory bank that we use to create all kinds of operations in our conscious world of being and doing. So it's the storehouse, they call it, the storehouse of memories of samskara. And we'll talk more about samskara later, but that basically means the things that you learn that become part of your subconscious landscape that color the way you think, you act, and you speak. So there's a lot there. Nirodha just means, oh boy, I looked that one up specifically. Yeah, to stop the storminess, to stop the fluctuations, the wild back and forth that's happening all the time. Okay. So any questions so far about anything I've talked about so far? Or comments?
I don't think so. You've actually like made it more clear because I've read through like I think the first 20 or so, but they are really difficult to understand in some of the other book that I have. But you're like actually clearing it up easily. You're putting it into real English. That makes sense.
I'm glad. Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I really liked the metaphor that you used because I was also staring at this little like picture that you used for this as well, and I feel like all the little white bits are like little is it chitta? Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, chittas. And but the big picture is like very ocean, and so they're all like little pieces of it. I liked this. This was also really good imagery to go with your metaphor.
Thank you. Yeah, and it has like this quality of movement.
Mm-hmm.
And Rhoda is the god of storms, very stormy, and so Ni is negating. So yoga, chitta, vritti. Vritti is the mind waves. Oh, and I didn't talk about that one yet. Nirodha, so negating the storminess of these mind waves. So vritti, we're going to go into them very soon, what they are, the specific ones. There are 5, but essentially the vritti are the mind waves. If you ever hear or read the phrase modifications of the mind, I found that very confusing for a long time. It just means the mind waves. It just means the thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I have the secret power of yoga, so I have that one already.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have, I think it's written by one of her Indian teachers, and it's very difficult to understand.
Yeah, their minds are so brilliant and holding all kinds of knowledge in at one time, and I think they have sometimes they're not efficient at getting it out in a really clear way.
This is efficient. I'm understanding everything so far.
It's like, how do you put this stuff into simple terms if you're already completely at one with the universe?
Yeah.
So, okay. So number 3, then the seer and seen become one. Or realize the oneness that already is. That's Rama's special take on that. And I love it. I think it's so good to think of it that way. Realizing the oneness that already is. And by seer and seen, they just mean you are the seer, and what is the seen is whatever you're meditating on, right? That it can be the breath, it can be your heart center, it can be God. Whatever you're meditating on, you become one with it. And it doesn't really matter so much what you're meditating on, in my opinion. Just being able to still your mind enough to become one with something is the biggest part of that, is the most important part. Because there's this quality of like letting go of the fetters that keep you tied to your suffering, these ideas of individuality or ego or all the other cliches that we're going to talk about in either class 2 or 3. I'm not sure yet. Okay, so and then at other times the seer appears to assume the modifications of the mind. And there's that phrase again. That just means you are caught up in your thoughts. You're not really in a place of equanimity, of groundedness, of not detachment, but non-attachment. You kind of are living the delusion that you are what is happening in your mind, that's all that exists for you in your awareness at that moment. But we can go back and forth between these. You know, especially if we're not renunciates, you know, nuns and monks and sannyasins, we really can't just spend our time in samadhi 100% of the time. We need to come out of that to be able to function, to make a living, to raise our families, etc. So Nishala's interpretation, united in the heart, because remember she said yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. United in the heart, consciousness is steadied. Then we abide in our true nature, which is joy. And at other times we identify with the rays of consciousness, which fluctuate and encourage our perceived suffering. I just think that her translation of the 4th sutra is so complete. It really puts forward everything that is meant by that particular collection of words. So the literal translation, though, if you take the Sanskrit word syllable for syllable of number 4, is the vrittis are with or take on the form of the night. So Patanjali is using a little bit of poetic imagery for us with that. And what does that mean? What does that mean to you?
I think often people think like night and shadows go together. So it's like they take on the form of our shadows or take on the form of like what we're fighting against, like our demons, our thoughts that we want to shy away from.
Yeah, there's like this sneakiness in there.
Yeah.
Right? Like you might not even realize, you might not see it, that you're in it. That the demons are knocking on your door and running your life and you don't even see it. Okay. Here we go. The vrittis are 5. Painful and non-painful. I like to think of helpful or non-helpful. They can also be neutral. So let's take a look at the vrittis. It's vital to know that in yogic philosophy and Hindu philosophy, regards thoughts and all mind activity as material. This puts them in the same category as light waves, radio and sound waves, etc., which means that they act on and interact with the material world in real ways. So if you've ever heard that your thoughts shape your reality, we take this literally. It's literally true, because the thoughts are real things with a physical manifestation as a wave. So they're neither good nor bad, they just are. Yeah. So pramana, correct perception, and viparya, incorrect perception. I really struggled with these for a very long time, reading lots of different interpretations and never really getting an answer that satisfied me. So let's look at what's out there for us. Pramana is broken down mostly into direct experience, indirect experience, and inference. Ramana points out to us that the further we get from direct experience, the easier it is to be misled. Initialist translation says, knowledge embraces personal experience, inference, and insights from the wise. So slightly different. Personal experience is there, inference is there in both of those translations, but insights from the wise is something unique to her ideas. She's talking about, finding a teacher who you really trust, who has done their due diligence and really studied, and you feel like you can believe what they're saying. And they not only have they studied, etc., but they model the correct way of living. They're an upstanding example of morality and good practice. It's my understanding, though, that these can all still be incorrect. Even in direct experience, we can be misled by our senses or by other people. Our brains are built to make inferences in the name of efficiency. There we go into the chitta with samskara, right? We use what we have seen and learned before to fill in the gaps when we don't have complete information. And we begin doing this from birth, and we're so good at it, we don't even realize we're doing it. We're doing it all the time. So in my opinion, being able to identify when you're making an inference is essential to social, emotional, and occupational intelligence. We have to be able to say, okay, I'm coming to this conclusion and I realize I don't have the full information, but this is what it looks like for me right now, right? I take exception to the idea that perceptions can be definitively classified as correct or incorrect. Because despite our best efforts and development of mental clarity, what is quote unquote real can always change. So this calls for some mental flexibility and a sense of humor. After all, we live in a world where nothing is real except for consciousness itself. Whether you want to call that universal consciousness, you want to call it God, you want to call it universe, whatever that spirit is, that's the only thing that's real. Definitively, 100%, we know without a doubt, will always be real, will never change. I take a cue from Nishala and I seek to develop an understanding of my heart and its intuition above all other sources of information. I often seek to test my intuitive perceptions against proof in the world around me. So I'll say, I have this feeling in my heart or in my gut. Is there any evidence around me that supports that? Or is there any evidence to the contrary, right? After all, our intuition sometimes is colored by our samskara, our previous experiences. So we have to always be questioning. Above all, if I make a judgment, I make it tentatively. Thinking, okay, well, this is what I think right now. It could change, right? I think pramana and viparya are pointing us. So correct perception and incorrect perception, quote unquote, are pointing us to the mind waves of openness versus jumping to conclusions. That's what I think. It's not really about what's right or wrong, what's true or untrue, because those things are shifting all the time. With that said, we can always seek to find truth within ourselves and within the world around us, and it's there if you look for it. So in regard to misunderstanding, Nishala says, listen carefully with your heart and your mind. Ask for clarification when there's even the slightest doubt. And most important, use a liberal amount of forgiveness for mistakes. After all, the mistake might be yours. And then she says later, the greatest wisdom is the insights in the heart. This is the wisdom we cannot deny. The more we trust and honor it, the more it guides us. Okay. So then we go to the third vritti, which is vikalpa, imagination. Vikalpa literally means outside of sequence, outside of time. So it's important to know that imagining, using your imagination, can be so powerful that the unconscious mind can believe that it's real and be activated by it. And this happens a lot with trauma. We're taking ourselves back in time sometimes, right? And reliving experiences, even though that's not really what's happening right now. But our body is acting like it's really happening. So another thing that I want to point out is that, you know, just going back to the idea of vrittis as material actually acting in the world. The things that we imagine can shape reality. And the things that we imagine, the mind waves we send out will attract similar frequencies to us. So if I'm constantly putting out lots of anxiety, I'm going to attract people to me who are also very anxious. Not that that's like, I'm not trying to condemn anxiety. We all have it to a certain extent, but it's just good to be aware of the effect that your thinking has on yourself and the world around you, and on your body. Even your imagination can change things in your body. You've heard of people worrying themselves sick. That's a real thing. So let's look at the positives and negatives of imagination, for lack of a better example, for lack of better words. Under the positives, we have all these really cool things that we can do with our imaginations. Okay. And we know that visualization can be extremely healing. We know that daydreaming is a really important part of maintaining a healthy brain. We can use our imaginations for entertainment, right? This is really cool. Lots of good stuff here. And then we have the other side of imagination, the unhelpful side, paranoia, anxiety, abnormal memory. So sometimes we don't remember things as they actually happened, or we kind of color our memories with our stories. Like if I'm trying to tell a story a certain way, my memory can change the facts to reflect the story that I wanted to tell. Scapegoating, entitlement, shoulding, insecurity, all the what ifs, all the catastrophizing, expectations of others, blame, all this stuff is coming from your imagination. What do you think of that? Any comments about it?
No, I feel like it hits right on the money.
Yeah, so one way that this shows up in my life personally, I'm so glad I don't do this as often anymore, but it still happens, is that I used to imagine really horrible things happening, like people that I love dying horrible, tragic deaths. And I'd get really upset about it and start crying. And I'd be imagining the funeral, and I'd be imagining, myself just being so depressed. Um, and I don't really know why I did that. I think I was probably getting something out of it at the time, but um, it was definitely not helping, right?
Mm.
And I came to a point where in my studies where I realized, you better stop doing this because you might actually make it happen. So, yeah, there's that. But something I wanted to remind you of, and this is a teaching that's out there all over the place. I can't really attribute this to one person in particular, but it's this idea that nothing your mind does is abnormal. I think that's what Patanjali wants us to know too, is that sure, the mind can do all sorts of things that are not helpful, but it's all within the scope of what is normal for a human mind to do. And that every pattern that you have was once an adaptation that was getting you through an incomprehensible situation intact. So everything our minds do that are not helpful now, at one point it was helpful. At one point, that was our human resilience getting us through something really hard. So maybe the patterns we took on earlier in our lives are no longer helpful. We have the power to change them. Okay. The fourth vritti, sleep. So dreaming is nidra and vikalpa occurring together. Oh, I didn't mention this yet, but yeah, they're in my mind, when I first started studying the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there was a lot of doubt for me that everything my mind does could be boiled down to 5 things. Right? It was like, no way. My mind is not that simple. There's no way. This is just another example of somebody creating a system for something that's way too fluid to be systematized. But I've been thinking about these things for years and years and years, and it really actually does boil down to all these things. But the answer I came up with is that these vrittis occur together in countless combinations that create all these different types of thinking and feeling. And if you think about the primary colors, we have 3 primary colors that create the vast palette of color that we see in the world around us, with so many shades, so many different subtle variations. That's the way I think of the vrittis. So in sleep, we have nidra. So when you dream, it's nidra and vikalpa occurring together. There are 3 different kinds of sleep. Physical sleep, pretty obvious what that is. Psychological sleep, right? Looks various ways. These are just the ways that we avoid or we dull our mind. So it's worth noting that in a stressful situation, your consciousness moves from the prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking, logical, smart, intelligent part of your brain, back to your brain stem where we have the fight or flight response. So you're not really awake, in my opinion, when that's happening. You seem to be awake, but you're not really thinking very well. You're kind of being managed by your baser instincts to survive. So I would consider that a part of psychological sleep. Spiritual sleep, not remembering who you really are. That's avidya. It's one of the kleshas. We're going to talk about that. And mystical sleep. So, we have stories about swamis who can go to sleep and then um, astrally project themselves into different places. Wow. I doubt I'll ever be able to do that, but it sounds cool. And then there's yoga nidra. This is where we're awake, but we're kind of hovering in that space between sleep and wakefulness. The brain waves are slowing down. And it's really, really great potential for healing there. Okay. Yeah, there's a quote from Rama. She says, when we awaken, when we come out of the psychological sleep, we may feel our own and others' pain. This pain can either inspire us to serve or may cause us to seek a variety of ways to avoid, withdraw, and not face a situation. So, something you could think about, is there a situation in my life or a part of myself, right, that I don't want to face, that I'm avoiding facing or avoiding dealing with? Now, remember, yoga is awakening, so we want to try to, heroically and bravely actively seek out those areas of shadow and darkness, with always with compassion and knowing that we can't do it all at once. It's not going to happen in a day. Maybe if you're just starting out, you start with the stuff that's easiest, right? You get some experience and skill working with your shadows before you take on the really big, mean, ugly monsters. Okay, memory. Memory is fairly self-explanatory, although it can be complex if you look at it in the context of like memory research done by Peter Levine and other trauma researchers. The way we create memory changes based on our level of stress. The way we recall events is dependent on the context in which they happened, shaded by our beliefs and expectations, interpretations of the events, and motives of others involved. So your interpretation of something will definitely create a specific type of memory. Sense of smell is deeply, deeply tied in with memory. We've all heard that on the news, yeah? Yeah. And then there's traumatic memory versus normal memory. If you've ever had trouble remembering something that was traumatic, like as a narrative from beginning to end, that's because that's not the way your brain is storing the memory when you're in that stress state. The memories, the processing becomes really fractured. You might recall things out of order. Certain details might be completely lost while others are taking up an inordinate amount of space in your memory. For example, a smell or, an inanimate object that was nearby that you just were focusing on. This is, recent research showing light on this phenomenon has really helped bring justice to people who would have otherwise been released because their victims weren't actually able to recall things very well. That used to be a reason to dismiss a case or to say that the person was lying. That's not true. We now know that's just a normal part of being through a stressful event. So samskara, we have talked a little bit about this already. Things that we experience that go into our subconscious memory bank and influence the way we think, the way we act, the way we talk. We are a lot of the time, I think a lot of people are not aware that that's what's happening. And once we become aware, we can start teasing those things out, working with the samskara and releasing them through yoga practices. And this is a way of clarifying the mind. We're getting out all the debris, all the residue, all the junk in the drawer, so that we have a much clearer, wider space to work from. Vashana are essentially really, really deep impressions that some say come to this life with us from previous lives. So they're like the granddaddy of samskara, right? Things that we've been carrying around for a while, or things that just went really, really deep. They can also be processed and worked through. They obviously will take longer and even maybe take more practice before you can even become aware of them. So moving on from the vrittis, the next two concepts that Patanjali introduces us to for yoga, for doing yoga, abhyasa and vairagya. So abhyasa means continuous sustained practice, and vairagya means non-attachment. Nishala says practice and remember, because vairagya means forgetfulness, not remembering who you are. No, sorry, that's avidya. Vairagya, non-attachment. And then Rama says continuous practice and non-attachment. So I think if Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha is the heart of yoga, then Abhyasa and Vairagya are the legs that carry you forward. Abhyasa literally translates to rising above the downward pull. That's a pretty cool image. Rising above the downward pull, being pulled down into the delusion of separateness, the heaviness of the ego and the samskara. We're rising above that. Abhyasa. But the message, though, is continuous sustained practice. And so with non-attachment, vairagya, in yoga, think of letting go of thinking that things have to be a certain way. So the way we practice vairagya in asana is letting go of the idea that we have to look like the girl on the cover of Yoga Journal. Letting go of the idea that I have to be able to have a handstand and hold it for at least 30 seconds. You don't actually have to do that. What do you have to do? You have to show up every time that you're supposed to show up. You have to keep coming and keep practicing. You have to keep trying to liberate yourself. Your handstand doesn't matter, you know, and so that's more of a macro way of looking at it, but a micro way of looking at it is from day to day. You might go to a yoga class thinking, I'm gonna have this vigorous practice. I'm gonna, you know, burn off all this energy. And then you get there and all of a sudden you realize your body's in a lot of pain that day, or maybe you're just really exhausted, and you have to let go of thinking that your yoga practice was going to look a certain way, because it's not going to look that way today, maybe tomorrow, right? So actually I wanted to have a little conversation about vairagya, because there's a lot of confusion about non-attachment. There's a lot of idea out there that, I mean, people just take non-attachment to extremes, don't they?
Yeah.
They do, in unhealthy ways. We have to try to find a balance with that.
It really reminds me of this moment that I was in Mount Shasta in a yoga class, and this guy in the yoga class like refusing to use a yoga mat because he wanted to be as close to the earth as possible. And how he's like, I'm disattaching from the plastic underneath me. And I'm just like, you are just going to make your body hurt, but okay, do you? And it just feels like he's like, I'm letting go of the ego. And in reality, it just feels so fully trapped by the ego of like not even going ahead and using a yoga mat because it's made of plastic and you want to be as close to the earth as possible.
Yeah.
It was wild. I was like, that is something.
Yeah. It can be taken to extremes by people with good intentions. Examples that come to mind for me are, the yogis in India, the Babas, who practiced extreme austerities. So I saw this documentary where there was this man who had his arm lifted over his head, and he had that lifted over his head for 30 years. It was actually stuck in that position. And the interviewer was like, "Was it painful?" He's like, "Well, yeah, but what is pain? I have to let go of my ego and not have pain. So are you willing to hurt yourself in the name of non-attachment?" So that's the most obvious example. And like your guy with the yoga with no mat, and it's like the number one thing we come to is, well, we need to practice non-attachment without doing harm to ourselves or others. If it's going to harm me, I'm not going to do it. Right. And it's like there are a lot of shades of gray here. It's going to be very individual to each person how they want to take this teaching into their lives. I heard a Dharma talk one time where the teacher was saying that if you were really established in your practice, then you would never be bothered by hunger. You would starve to death without even being bothered by it, essentially. I'm like, that doesn't sound like non-attachment to me. That sounds like something really unhealthy.
Yeah. I don't know.
And
For me, in this aspect, it just feels like non-attachment is just like coming in without having an expectation, because
yeah,
expectations is where then you start to like feel if things aren't meeting that expectation, you're going to start to resent it, or like it's just like never going to be good enough. But if you walk in without an expectation in mind, then you can get the best out of the circumstance.
100%. 100% of the time. And remember, these teachings are for us to reduce our suffering. And one of the fundamental ideas in these teachings is that suffering arises when the world doesn't look, feel the way you want it to, when things don't happen that you want, when you don't get what you want or expect. That's the root of suffering. Okay. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for a long time. And this is the last slide of the day. So we're doing good. The 4 locks and keys.
Are they 8 different? Is this 8 different things, or is this 4 locks and the 4 keys are the exact same thing? They're both locks and keys. There's 4 of them.
The second one.
The second one, okay.
So this is a really famous sutra. People use this all the time. Maitri Karuna Mudita Upekshanam. And I'll just read Nishala's translation because it's pretty accurate across the board compared to all the others. To preserve openness of heart and calmness of mind. Nurture these attitudes. Kindness to those who are happy. Right. Maitri. So we're talking about compassionate joy. Sometimes jealousy gets in the way of that. We see someone who has something that we feel we deserve. We might say, she didn't even work for that. It's not fair. Look at how much I struggle and work, and I don't have that. That's not helping. The attitude to have is, oh, happy for her. That's great. and to even be able to derive some joy from someone else's joy, right? It elevates you. It brings you up, and I think it makes you more likely to receive that same thing, or some measure of it in accordance with what's right for you based on the universe's wisdom. And then we have compassion for those who are less fortunate, karuna. Okay. So that's a pretty easy one, I think, to understand. And the opposite of that we see in our culture is condemnation of, for example, poor people. Like, we've always had this idea in our culture of deserving poor and non-deserving poor. Well, I'll donate to a charity, but it has to be a charity that makes people work, right? I don't want to give anybody just a free handout. And even in our town, there's a lot of anger, blame, bitterness towards unhoused people. Honor for those who embody noble qualities. Yeah, that one was important for me. I used to actually resent people who had these noble qualities. Ugh, they think they're so great. But there's a calling for humbleness here. I think that the Maitri folds in with this as well. And then equanimity for those whose actions oppose your values, upeksha. Yeah, so we see people doing stuff we don't approve of all over, all around us. What's the right attitude to have towards that? Equanimity. So what does equanimity mean? What does it mean?
Honestly, this is a word that I find difficult to even define without looking up the definition. But it just feels like having like looking at them as somebody who's still equal, that you're not like putting yourself above them because you don't do these actions and they do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, in a big way, equanimity. So like the most literal translation is non-judgment, right? So exactly what you said. We're not judging someone. We're, not thinking that they're less of a person than I am because they drive a gas guzzling truck and I think that's wrong. Right? I think it also ties in with this non-attachment idea. People are never going to be what we want them to be. They're always going to be exactly what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So we can let people be who they are. Equanimity includes acceptance. And that's hard sometimes because some things that are in the world we don't want to accept because it really bothers us, right? But acceptance is beautiful, especially in those situations, because we can say, it's not what I would choose, but for now, it is what it is. I'm going to be okay with it. I'm not going to let it upset my inner peace. And we can remain open to change later. That's the magic piece. I'm going to make sure my heart remains open and my mind remains open and on the lookout for opportunities for change, peaceful change. Equanimity. Equanimity to those whose actions oppose your values. So all of these apply to our attitudes towards others, but even more importantly, towards ourselves. And we really have to get good at doing this for ourselves first. Can I allow myself to experience happiness and really embody that happiness and not have these thoughts of, well, I don't deserve it, or I'll be happy later when I get this job that I want, or later when I have more money, or later when I have the right partner. Can I be happy now? Compassion for yourself. What does that feel like? Honor. Oh, go ahead.
I was like, is that a real question?
Go ahead.
It was like compassion for myself is sometimes really hard, especially since like I'm a very compassionate person for like others all the time. And like people come like talk to me a lot being like, hey, what I'm feeling like this like guilt about not going to class today, but I really want to go to the gym. And I'm just like, well, you want to do something that's good for your body. But class today was probably just going to not be good for your mental health, and that's okay. But for my own self, sometimes I won't even like give myself the compassion of like, I'm legitimately sick and I have to cancel on clients for the day. I'll feel guilty about that and like put myself down in my head for being sick. Like I can't help being sick.
Like you've done something wrong,
Yeah,
like it's a character flaw or something. Yeah. It's almost like we treat others better than we treat ourselves.
always. For some reason, it's definitely something.
But you're the only person who's going to be in your life from the very beginning to the very end.
Hmm.
I also have a really long, intense history of being really hard on myself. And one of the things that helped me overcome that, it still helps because I'm still not completely over it, is to ask myself, how would I respond to my best friend if she was telling me this? What would I say to her?
Hmm.
And then try to do that for myself. Um, okay, so there's one thing I want to read to you that's kind of going to help us with the rest of chapter 1. What page? It was page 75. This is from Nishala. Okay. So these are actually, yeah, this is a really good summary of the rest of the Yoga Sutras, and it's going to include the 1.33 that we just talked about. Perception of our true nature is often obscured by physical, mental, and emotional imbalances. These imbalances can promote restlessness, uneven breathing, worry, and loss of hope. These imbalances can be prevented from engaging and developing loyalty to a sacred practice. So this particular little section, Patanjali goes ahead and lists all these distractions that, in my opinion, kind of starts to sound condemning if you're just starting out on your journey studying this material. It almost sounds a little like 10 commandments. You know, one of them is laziness, for example. I don't think it's super helpful to focus in on those things.
Did you say this is in Nishala's? Nishala?
Yeah, so I'm on page 75. So I've stopped reading Nishala to explain that Patanjali lists distractions. The reason he's doing it is out of compassion, but I don't know if it's the translation or what, but it just, to me, because of the way I've been hard on myself and etc. When I first read those things, it felt like I was being put down, right? It felt really condemning. It felt like just more religious trauma, which is why I have chosen not to go into those specific things in this class. But it's just good to know that there are distractions there. They happen, and Patanjali gives us advice on how to deal with them. So I'll read it again. Perception of our true nature is often obscured by physical, mental, and emotional imbalances. These imbalances can promote restlessness. So he's telling us, look out for these things. If these things are happening, you can be sure that you're kind of wobbling away from the path that you want to be on. Restlessness of the body or the mind, uneven breathing, worry, and loss of hope. These imbalances, he then tells us, can be prevented by engaging and developing loyalty to a sacred practice. And so then he tells us to preserve openness of heart and calmness of mind, nurture these attitudes. And we have Sutra 1.33, kindness, compassion, honor, and equanimity. And then beyond that, we have more advice. Slow, easeful exhalations. So now he's getting really specific. Can be used to restore and preserve balance. Or, here come a lot of ors. So I love this part. Or engage the focus on an inspiring object. Or cultivate devotion to the supreme, ever blissful light within. He's talking about bhakti yoga, devotion, and we're going to talk about that next time. Or receive grace from a great soul who exudes divine qualities. This could be a guru. It could be meditating on Jesus Christ. It could be anything. He's not specific. He just says a great soul who exudes divine qualities. Or reflect on a peaceful feeling from an experience, a dream, or a deep sleep. Or here's the final and best one, dedicate yourself to anything that elevates and embraces your heart. Thank you, Patanjali. He's basically saying, look, I've told you what it is you're working towards. There isn't really a specific recipe. There's no prescribed ritual that will 100% get everybody there. Like, find something that works for you. And then in chapter 2, Patanjali will give us the first 5 of the 8 limbs of yoga. Before that, though, he gives us the kleshas, and the kleshas are the veils that keep us from seeing the truth of the world, the veils that blind us, the veils that hold us back from being enlightened. So he gives us the vrittis, then he gives us the kleshas, and he, in chapter 1, he gives us a lot of description about samadhi, like what it is, what it feels like, the different types of samadhi that there are. And I just thought that's all very technical and it's kind of boring, to be honest. So I left it out of this one, but it's good to know that it's there. And so in summary, chapter 1 is like, here's what we're working towards. And then chapter 2 is, this is how you get there. And that's the end of what I had planned for today, but we still have a couple minutes if you have any more questions or comments.
I don't think so. I feel like it has taken me forever to get to any point of knowing any of the information about the sutras from reading it from the other book that I was reading, because the words just don't make sense. They were in one ear, out the other, and this just feels like
I get it. Yeah.
Finally digestible.
Just curious, who were you reading?
Well, let me find the book. One moment. It's gonna be right next to me over here.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. Reading from this book. Sri Swami Satchidananda.
Sri Swami Satchitananda. Yeah, that was one of Nishala's teachers.
Yeah. This.
And he is certainly a very well enlightened, or was a very well enlightened person. But you can see what I mean by it can be hard to understand and it can be hard to relate. I had the same experience reading some of these people, and it's like once you find someone you jive with, you can stick with them, and then they often will be able to turn you on to other people that are gonna also be up your alley.
Mm-hmm.
So Rama Jyoti Vernon, this is my book. You can see that it's like it's so full of notes and everything. She actually signed this for me. I met her. She came to the yoga therapy training. Beautiful woman, just very dedicated yogi, very, very deep understanding of everything. I do find her writing to be dense. Not that it's not understandable, but small bites are better with her.
Mm-hmm.
But that's actually a good rule in general. I never sit down and just jam through one of these books in a couple of days.
Yeah.
I read a couple pages and then I put it down and I think about it, meditate about it, live it, and then come back. What's the rush, And if you really want to integrate something, that's the way to do it. Yeah. Okay. So let's close with yes, we'll do the Purnamada mantra. This is a mantra that asserts the fullness of the universe, fullness of individuals, fullness of you and me, acknowledging that we are all whole and complete exactly as we are. And I think that feeling joy in that is the ultimate act of gratitude. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Now, with your hands together in front of your heart in Anjali Mudra, I bow to the light in you and throughout space and time to the light in anyone else who watches this video, because it's the same as the light in me. We are one. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you.